want to just pose this question to you. And as we've started out the last several weeks, there's been a lot of audience participation that's been invited. And so I think it's been fun. Hopefully you've enjoyed it too. And it's been great to learn from you because all of you are part of this community or other communities and part of the larger family of God, perhaps also worldwide. And so it's good to give feedback and interaction because we can learn so much from each other. But another one of my friends and his wife June, Derek and June, are good friends of mine. We've been friends for quite a long time. And God's been leading them toward a new endeavor of planting a church in the area. And their target area is kind of south end of St. George. And as we've talked and had conversations, he's been sharing with me, his kind of approach and starting to form some foundational things like, what is the purpose of this church? How do we summarize who we are? And months ago, we tried to reformat our website here at Mountain View, and we were coming up across the same question. How do we encapsulate who we are as a church community and put that into a sentence or two? So if somebody approached you, and it might be this church or you might be a part of another church community somewhere else, but if somebody approached you and said, how would you summarize your church in a sentence? What would you say? What do you think? How would you do it? I put you on the spot, but what do you got? Yes?
We've been there a very short time, so I would just like to say that from the day we walked through that door, we kind of felt God's presence in the song about that somewhere. And that's how I kind of felt because of the warmth.
Sure.
The reception that we get from the people. And it just has continued. Every week that we come, it's like something is nurturing me inside with God. And I really appreciate your sermons because you do give us an outline, you keep us focused, and you give us food for thought throughout the week. And that's, I no longer
Sure.
the sentence.
No, that's good. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Yeah. So just to summarize Shirley, she said a place where you can really feel God's presence, where you're received warmly, and where kind of like your thoughts are provoked as far as learning and God speaking to you that way. So that would be maybe one way. Yeah, and again, I'm just trying to consolidate it, and I'm also trying to rephrase it for people who are listening online because we don't have you mic'd up. But anybody else? How would you, or maybe Derek, if you want to give me a sentence for your, okay, not yet. Still in the formative. Deborah.
We learn from the Word here. We learn from the Bible. I really appreciate that as well.
Okay, so we're a community that learns from the Bible. That would be a short summary. Yes, Ed.
It says it in the title, Mountain View Bible Church, we teach the Bible, God's Word.
Okay, we teach the Bible. Okay. Somebody else. I saw a hand over here. Andrew?
I would say the difference between this church and a lot of the churches I've been to is the amount of genuine compassion and relationship that get built just on coming into the church. And I feel everyone has a level of care and compassion to everyone that walks into the building. And
Sure.
to get closer to God on the way there.
So a place of genuine compassion and care where you can be drawn closer to the Lord as well. All those are really good thoughts. And so you can see how it'd be harder to put all that right into just a simple phrase. And that's kind of what we come across in this passage today, only maybe even to a greater extent. Something akin to that might be, how would you summarize your purpose in life in a sentence or less, right? We think about a church community, but if you really thought about your life, how would you encapsulate that into one phrase? And Jesus has asked something I would say just as difficult, and that would be, how do you encapsulate all that God has to say to you in a sentence or less, right? How would you answer that one? And that essentially is the question that's asked of Jesus. We've talked about the last couple of weeks how different groups of people, religious and political leaders in Jerusalem mainly, have come up to Jesus and they've had test after test. And as far as timeline, we're just a few days before Jesus' betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion in Jerusalem. And so it's the Feast of Passover. Maybe over 1 million people have come in from various parts of the Roman world, descended on Jerusalem for this celebration and this feast, remembering the time when God freed the people from Egypt and passed over those people, not providing judgment and punishment on them because of the blood of the lamb that was over the doorposts and so on. So God's people freed from slavery in Egypt 1,400 years ago, massive celebration. And the religious leaders are stepping up to the plate and throwing test after test at Jesus. And this one comes from the Pharisees. It says, we'll pick up in Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40. And I'll try to trim this because I want us to be able to focus on some more discussion questions that really help us personalize this today as well and also be sensitive to time. But it says this in verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, we talked about that last week. If you want more on that, we do have a YouTube channel, so you can watch that or just talk to somebody who was here and they can give you a summary, or John can give you a few thoughts on that as well. But they came together, and one of them, an expert in the law, from this group called the Pharisees, who were very devoted to different traditional interpretations of the Jewish law passed down for hundreds of years, asked this question to test Jesus. So the first two tests, Jesus passes with flying colors. Everybody's frustrated who asked the question because they didn't prove that Jesus was a fraud. Here's question 3. Teacher, which command in the law, and that's talking about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible in the Jewish context. So if you would delineate out a list of commands, different Jewish leaders, they come up with a couple different numbers. One is 611, another one is 613. Those are the going, numbers. If you have to summarize how many commands or different instructions is really a better way to define it, maybe, or in the Old Testament law in the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament today. So which one of those out of 600 and some, which one's the greatest? The most important, the most filled with direct purpose. And the idea behind that as well is the one that's going to bring us closer to God than any other command. So how's Jesus going to approach that? How's he going to step up to the plate and answer that? And just so you're aware, culturally as well, the Jews, they really cultivated an environment of discussion. And so when we get together and you have Bible study groups, or you get together in one of those living rooms, have table conversations, or when we open things up for discussion here in public, this is very culturally familiar to somebody from a Jewish background. There's a lot of dialogue and a lot of discussion. In our day and age, it's kind of like, well, let's go to a lecture on Sunday morning and hear what somebody has to tell me, about what's right or what to believe. But the Jewish people approached Scripture in a much more discussion-oriented way. They would go back and forth and not always agree with each other. And so this is very common. And it was common for them to talk about questions like that, to attempt to condense all of these different instructions from God into like the smallest possible unit. There's a rabbi, his name's Rabbi Similai. He's no relation to the rabbi that you mentioned because he lived in the 3rd century, so hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But he remarked this. He said, when I look back through all of what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish people call the Tanakh, throughout all that, I see different writers summarizing it. He said David in Psalm 15 seems to summarize the whole Old Testament in 15 commands. Just for a little example, this is what David wrote. He said, Lord, who can dwell in your tent? In other words, who is really, really close to your presence? Talking about the tabernacle, the place where God's presence was consolidated. Who can live on your holy mountain, an image to the Garden of Eden? Who can walk in your presence? And this is what David said. The person who lives blamelessly, who practices righteousness, who acknowledges truth in his heart, who doesn't slander people with his words, who doesn't harm his friend, who doesn't discredit his neighbor, who despises the one that's rejected by the Lord, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps his word no matter the cost, who doesn't lend his money at interest, who doesn't take a bribe against the innocent. The one who does these things will never be shaken. So David said, if I had to, summarize things in a few commands, I'd pick these 11. Other authors like Isaiah actually whittled things down to 6 in chapter 33. Micah down to 3, he said, act justly, love faithfulness, and walk humbly with your God. If you do that, you're doing pretty well. Amos pulled things down to one statement, seek God and live. That's what he said. If I had to encapsulate all of what life is about and our purpose and our relationship with God, I would just say, seek God and live. That's how I do it. And so throughout history, and there's other historical examples as well, Jewish people tried to really boil things down. And that question is asking Jesus to do the same. How are you going to boil things down? What's the most important thing to draw us close in our covenant relationship with God? Because Israel and God, their relationship is kind of like a marriage. They have certain conditions, just like if you get married and you say something like, I'm marrying you to love, honor, and cherish you in sickness and health, for better, for worse, all those things, like you have a few conditions. And so really God's instructions to Israel are saying, if you want a close relationship with me, live by these types of conditions. And so Jesus is trying to summarize what types of conditions will keep God and people close. That's what he's really doing here when he's answering this question. But again, these questions are formed to try to expose Jesus as a fraud. The religious leaders want to embarrass Jesus publicly. And so they want to have some reason to say, Jesus, your answer is inadequate. You don't fully reflect God's purposes with your answer. And so let's see what you come up with, Jesus. That's the intention behind it. And this is how Jesus answers the question. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command, or we would say instruction if we want to translate that literally probably today. So love the Lord your God. And that term love, it means to act. It's not just an emotion. It means to act loyally or act in response to your commitment to God. And it's interesting, too, because Jesus, he uses it in a future tense. And so he says, you will do this. You will act loyally to the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is a very classic answer because every single day, many Jews at this period of time, twice a day, on many occasions, they pray these exact words every day in a prayer called the Shema Israel. And that prayer starts out with those words. It actually starts out, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So he's not manifested through a multiplicity of different gods or idols like a lot of the cultures near them thought. And then the next words are, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And so Jesus, his answer is something that most of these Jewish people are praying a lot of times twice a day, every single day of their lives. So it's a very classic, very common answer. And the words, a couple observations about this, they're future statements. And so this is like, it's this eventual way of life, this ideal way of life to which God someday wants to restore humanity. You will do this. You will act on your loyalty to God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is what God's desire is. And it was happening pretty well until Adam and Eve walked away from the command to avoid this tree. And in doing so, they took good and evil into their own hands. They started to define good and evil for themselves. And once people start to do that and walk away from God's perspective, as John mentioned, God sees things differently than we do. When we start to define good and evil on our terms instead of from God's perspective, we get into lots of trouble and conflict, and we step away from that, and our relationship with God suffers because of it. And so this is something that Jesus is saying, this is what you should strive for. And someday, this is going to happen, but not with the hearts that you have right now. Something else. But this is sort of the goal, and maybe you can experience, some facets of this every day. And maybe we can experience, as followers of Jesus, just a little taste of this on a day-to-day basis in different ways in our lives. Another thing that's interesting here is if you read this quote in Deuteronomy, which is where Jesus is quoting from, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, he tweaked a word. And a lot of times rabbis in Jesus' time would do that. They would change a couple words to emphasize or de-emphasize something. And he replaces the word strength with mind. So if you read Deuteronomy, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. But Jesus tweaked it. He said, with all your mind. Why would he do something like that? And because I want to focus on other questions in our remaining time, I'm not going to open that up to you. Give you my thoughts, and this may or may not be right. But I think that the Pharisees who were questioning him, they thought, we're doing pretty good at loving God with all our strength. In fact, through our own ability and our own self-righteousness and our own ability to follow all these traditions and all these specific commands, and we'll hear more about those in the next couple of weeks. They're even tithing their spices and herbs that they're growing. I mean, they're setting aside 1/10 of that for either the house of God or for the poor people every 3 years. They're really good at following all these instructions and not walking too far on the Sabbath day and all these things. And for them, they're thinking, I'm doing a great job of loving God with all my strength. But if you read Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the larger context of that, what God is trying to do is pull people away from focusing on their own ability and drawing on God's ability to love him. And so I think Jesus altered it so they wouldn't get tripped up on that. And they wouldn't think, we're doing fine in that area. Our strength, we're great at serving God in our own strength, but that wasn't the point, to serve God in their own strength. And so I think that might be why Jesus alters that there. And so he gives them this greatest instruction. I will throw this question out to you. We have time for a couple responses on this. What in the world does it mean to love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind? How would you define it? If you had to paraphrase that or interpret that for somebody today, if they said, well, what does that practically mean? How would you answer? You probably heard this, many of you, for years and years. But what does it actually mean? What's a practical way that you could act on that? What do you think?
Love your neighbors, love yourself too.
Okay, that's going to be part of it, and we'll get to there. And as John mentioned, maybe it's through the tablets, right? There's a connection there. So maybe that is a good, valid answer. We're going to consider that. We're going to put it on the shelf for a second because we'll get there in a moment. How do you love God? Let's try to separate. Maybe you can't truly separate it from loving your neighbor. But if you're focusing on God more than expressions of love toward your neighbor, how are you going to do that? Okay, but what does that mean? How do you love God with all your heart, I guess is what I'm working toward. Does that make sense?
Obedience to God.
Obedience? Okay, there's a thought. Yeah, so, what?
Gratitude.
Gratitude. Oh, that's a good idea. I like that. Yeah.
To be a child of God, to follow the teachings of God, to build community and build relationships.
Okay, sure. So several things there. To be a child of God. Isn't that interesting? A lot of us, when we grow up, we forget what it's like to be a child. But children are super dependent, super moldable. They don't always react in predictable ways, but neither do we. But they're so dependent and so, they look up to their parents and they need them for so many things. And you're talking about not only being a child of God, depending on him, but community, relating together as community, and God sees this people of his operating like a family. Those are good answers. Any final thoughts? How do you love God? Yes?
How about fulfill your purpose?
Okay, fulfill your purpose. And that's going to take some homework, right? Because we've got to figure out what our purpose is, but sure. God made you unique, right? So Dave has a lot of strengths that some of you don't have, and vice versa. But how do you realize who God's made you to be and use that the best for him? Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes?
By building your relationship with the Lord on a daily basis.
Okay. We talked about covenant relationship with Israel, but the reality is Jesus opens up the possibility for us to have a relationship with God. And so we're not distant. We can communicate with God. And we can listen to God, and he can speak to us, and there are different ways that can happen, but this is like an actual relationship. And I have a problem, okay? When people move away from me or I move away from them, I'm really bad at maintaining long-distance relationships. And it's hard to relate with a God you can't physically see sometimes, right? It's easy to forget and get distracted or just focus on other things in life. But when you prioritize that, just like you prioritize keeping up with a friend who moved far away, God begins to show you things and answer your prayers and comfort you and show up in your life and open up opportunities. June. I'm sorry.
The only way I got to learn who God was by studying Scripture.
Okay, so that's another.
Not just once in a while.
Okay, yeah. And that is a deep ocean, studying Scripture. And the more that I learn, the more I know I don't learn, or the more that I don't know, right? And that's what I see, because when you're looking at a God who you can't ever hit bottom on understanding, it just is a wild world to step into. It's a lifelong, longer than life journey of trying to learn who God is. And that's part of that relationship that Andalina was talking about as well. Those are really, really good thoughts. And so that's kind of our objective. I think one of the things that Jesus wanted to answer and focus us in on and focus his hearers in on at that point in time in history. And so if you wanted to try to put that command in context in Deuteronomy 5 into a little summary, and not necessarily working on the practical examples that you all gave, but a way to understand that might be God's greatest instruction for Israel is to respond, because love it's a responding in loyalty, remembering that relationship they have with God, to respond to. And the idea behind your mind would be when you remember something, when you have a memory pop into it, that you're doing things. I think somebody said, being thankful is part of how you love God. So when you have something pop into your mind and you realize, this is a gift from God. God brought that into my life. God was saying through Moses to Israel and through Jesus to these people and through his word to us, when those memories pop into mind, don't just take them for granted. Stop and thank God that memory happened and that God provided that gift or that thing, or that he brought you through that difficult time. Focus that attention on him. Or it can be talking about contemplation. We talked about Scripture. And so when God brings something to mind, or you have a great discussion, a spiritual discussion with a friend, or when you open up the page maybe of your Bible and you read something and you're contemplating it and you have one of those wow moments or aha moments, just have a little interaction with God. That's a way to love him with all your heart, or with all your mind, I'm sorry. Then with all your soul, that's really connected to our desires. And that can go one of two ways. Sometimes we desire things, even like celebration, and that's a wonderful desire. And God wants us to celebrate. And so sometimes we'll respond to our desires that we have in positive ways. We'll act on our desire. And because we act on it, whether it's to serve somebody in love, whether it's to celebrate something in someone's life, or something that God has done for us, those acts of desire, motivated celebration, and good things, good actions, those are ways that we can love God. And then sometimes we love God by saying no to our desires, because we realize our desire is pretty selfish, or it's pretty destructive, or it's not what we're going to talk about in a minute, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And so we deny that desire And that's another way that we love God with our soul, because soul's talking about our living being. It's our desire. That's what we're connected to. It's our feelings, all those things. And then we talk about our heart. And heart is really convictions that we feel, or even things that God reveals to us through people or through experiences or through time or even through like his word as well or through teaching, all those things. And so we react with compassion or, again, a conviction. We act on that. And those are different ways that we can love God practically. And Deuteronomy gives a lot of other practical examples. They're in the notes on your bulletin if you want to take that home. If you didn't receive one, we can get a copy for you later. But there's different practical ways to work that out. So that's a wonderful answer to Jesus' question, right? We're done. We'll leave. Jesus could be done here because all they asked was, what's the greatest commandment? And he said it, right? He gave it to them. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He gives them another one. Why do you think he moves on? Why doesn't he just call it good? I mean, he gave an unbelievable answer, classic answer. So why does he keep throwing more things out there? What do you think? What's the next command, by the way? A lot of you know it. Go ahead and say it. What does he say next? Yeah, and love your neighbor. So that's a second command. Why does he put that in there? That's from a different place in the Old Testament. It's from Leviticus chapter 19. Why do you think? Why is he going to throw that in there? I mean, he's good. He already gave his answer. Maybe it's something that...
So you don't live for yourself.
Oh, there we go. So you don't live for yourself. Okay. What do you say, Shar?
So they're tied together. If you don't show the love of God to other people, then you're not loving God.
Yeah, they are tied together. And think about the Pharisees. They're really good at doing all these outward acts and expressing their love to God and praying all these flamboyant prayers, but they're really bad at treating people nice, okay? And so, yeah, I think there's some connection there. We can deceive ourselves because loving God can be easy sometimes. God loves us. He treats us well. He doesn't mistreat us. Sometimes he allows circumstances that we think are crazy, and so we tell him off or we curse him for a while or we walk away from him for a few years, but then we maybe come back around and realize, oh, like God really cares about me. But people are messy. People are offensive. People are different. People are bad, and so are we, but we don't see it. People are not easy to deal with, right? And so Jesus is going to attach a little bit of a twist, I think, to show them the true depth of what love is going to involve for them. He attaches this challenging twist because, as you all mentioned, and as John mentioned, they're connected, right? Loving God is connected with loving our neighbor. And that was pointed out on many different occasions. And the word neighbor, it means you're near one, the people who are near to you in life. And that can be the people that you choose to let get near you and the people that you're forced to allow to be near you. The people that just show up in your neighborhood because they move and you have no control of who goes in and who goes out of your neighborhood. The coworkers that you work with, good, bad, ugly, beautiful, all of it. Family members, right? And such a variety of humans we are on this planet. And so that's the challenge. The challenge is that people are far less loving and far more difficult to love than God is. And I want to talk about, as we kind of wrap things up today, we need to have a few conversations. One conversation that we need to talk about is who is my neighbor, okay? And so there's a couple different passages I want us to consider as we kind of close out today. The first one is the quotation, the area where Jesus is quoting from in the Old Testament, Leviticus 19, where Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So I want us to read through that, and I want you to think about that, and I want you to provide some answers to that question. Another one is a parable Jesus talks about elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke, where somebody asks Jesus, who's my neighbor? And Jesus gives a short story in response to show exactly who their neighbor is. So we want to spend the rest of our time answering two questions. Who is my neighbor? And how do I love my neighbor? Which are important things for us, I think, to dialogue about today. And so here is this passage in Leviticus. I'm going to read it to you, so just kind of listen. But if you can see the small print on your screen, go ahead and refer to that. And if not, you can open up Bibles that you have or your cell phone, things like that if you'd like. But here's that passage in Leviticus 19. It says, each of you, again, listen for the answers to this question. Who is my neighbor? Okay. Each of you is to respect his mother and father. When you reap the harvest of your land, you're not to reap the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Don't strip your vineyard bare either or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the foreign national living among you. Just real quick, definitions. Foreign national can mean someone living in your country who is from another country. They're living here illegally or legally. Okay, it's just a broad, all-encompassing term. Do not steal. Do not act deceptively or lie to one another. Don't oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages due a hired worker, your employee, must not remain with you till the next morning. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Do not be partial to the poor or give preference to the rich. Do not go about spreading slander. Do not harbor hatred against your brother. Confront your neighbor directly. Do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. You will regard the foreigner who resides with you as the native born among you. You are to love him as yourself. Who is my neighbor? What do you think? What do you see? There's several ones mentioned there. Who's my neighbor in Leviticus 19? Okay, anyone you come into contact with, that's much too broad. I'm looking for specific examples here. Okay, the poor person, right. Do you think everyone around you is just blissfully wealthy, has no needs? Are you in that category? The poor, people who have less means than what they need really to survive in this environment or to thrive. Who else? Who's your neighbor? Your brother, right. Like them or hate them, you're stuck with them because they're family. Who else is your neighbor?
Those you work with.
Your coworker, right. Yeah, sure, of course. Who else is your neighbor? A disabled person. So somebody with different abilities, okay? People of all abilities are your neighbor. And so in this case, it uses people who have some physical limitations. Some people would argue with that. A lot of people who are experiencing blindness, for example, they have heightened perception in other ways. And so they don't see that as a disability. But in this society, that would hinder you greatly from accomplishing work and other things. And so maybe people who are struggling with different physical limitations or various mental limitations, emotional limitations, things like that. Sure, they're your neighbor. Yes? Other people of other faiths, sure, of course. And this mentions people who are living from other cultures in your land, and a lot of times that comes with other belief systems, of course, other religious traditions or non-religious traditions. Who else? Who's your neighbor? Yes?
People you attend church with.
Okay, people you attend church with, your community. Yeah, these are your neighbors. So look next to look over at your neighbor, right? These are your neighbors. It mentions here people in your community. It mentions people who are rich. There's economic scales of neighbors here, right? It mentions people who are employed by you. It mentions people who are in your family, who live in close proximity. All these types of people are considered our neighbors, okay? And then we read a different story. It even mentions our parents in there, right? Because honor your father or mother is part of it. Who's your neighbor according to Jesus? He defines that as well. So let's look at Luke really fast. Luke chapter 10, verses 29 to 37. Take a read through that. But wanting to justify himself, an expert in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures, asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? So Jesus took up the question and said, here's a story. It'll give you the answer. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him, beat him up, and they fled, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the road. When he saw him, he just passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite who was responsible for setting up the physical aspects of the temple, lampstands, things like that, like moving things around, filling things with water, those types of natures, or that nature of things. He arrived at the place and saw him, and he also walked by on the other side of the road. But a Samaritan on his journey came up to him. So who are Samaritans? Samaritans are people who, they would say that they are descendants of the northern 10 tribes of Israel, who in, I think, 711 BC or something like that, the Assyrian Empire came in and devastated the northern 10 tribes of Israel, who were working under a separate king than the southern 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin at the time, and they deported many of the people out of the land. But some people remained in the land, and they worshiped God on a different mountain, and they had some different religious ideas, and they believed that they were also, heirs of those people who remained in the northern 10 tribes of Israel. They were their descendants. And there was a bitter feud that happened between the people of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and the people who remained in the land who were known as Samaritans. Some of it was over religious differences. Some of it was over just, personal conflicts or intertribal conflicts and things like that. But these people were, for all practical purposes, enemies. They devalued each other. They didn't see each other in a good light. So this guy came up to the man coming down from Jerusalem, who we assume from the story and the way Jesus tells it is very much Jewish, very much of the tribe of Judah or Benjamin, not a Samaritan. When he saw him, he had compassion. He went over to him and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine. He put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 days' wages, gave him to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him. When I come back from my business, and I'll reimburse him for whatever extra you've spent." And then Jesus says, who is the neighbor out of that story? So let's broaden that out. I know our time is probably fleeting this morning, but who, according to Jesus, who is our neighbor in light of that story? Okay, the Samaritan, everybody. Yeah, I think that's probably ultimately where Jesus is going. The Samaritan, but the Samaritan is the person that is very different here, right? Who doesn't get along, who is placed on the outside. And so really, from Jesus' perspective, my neighbor is the person that I'm inclined to judge, because the Samaritan, the Jewish people, really judged them and saw them as inferior. They even hated them. And so my neighbor is the person that, in my heart, I don't tell people about it, but I hate them the most. It's my enemy. And sometimes we imagine our enemies, and sometimes our enemies are actually harming us and mistreating us. Our neighbor is the person who opposes our beliefs, because the Samaritans and Jews had very different religious convictions. Our neighbor is the person with different political opinions and even different moral convictions. All these people are our neighbors. So then the question becomes, how do I love my neighbor? Because that's what Jesus said I should do. It's what Jesus told the Pharisees they should be doing. And so according to Leviticus and according to this story, from the things that you remember in Leviticus that we read, the things that you remember from the story of the Good Samaritan, we call it, that you just read, how do we love our neighbor? Any thoughts? What do you remember from that? What are some practical examples as we finish up today? Yes, in the back.
Show them kindness whenever possible.
Show them kindness whenever possible. Okay.
Take care of them.
Take care of them.
Into your home.
Okay. Bring them into your home. Sure.
Do not hold a grudge against them.
Don't hold a grudge against them. That's from Leviticus. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's hard, especially when people are mistreating you. How do we love our neighbor? Pray for them? Yeah, but not just in a like, oh, that poor person, I'll pray for you, right? Yeah, not in a like uppity way where we're seeing ourselves as better than they are, right? Yeah.
Maybe follow through, because this guy came back
Oh,
and just leave him.
that's a good observation. Yeah, follow through. It's easy to do one act of kindness one time and to say, yep, I love them. But this was, as Shar pointed out, this is more of an ongoing type of thing where you care enough to come back and check in on somebody. So just some highlights from Leviticus. Yes, go ahead, Robin.
The golden rule.
Okay.
Doing to other people as you would want them to do unto you in a circumstance, and also the verse where it says, whatever is good, whatever is right, whatever is beautiful, whatever is of good repute, think on these things, and it helps you to act in a way that is good.
Okay, that's good. Those are good thoughts. Robin said the golden rule, treating people the way you would want to be treated. And I think we're going to even expand that, take one step beyond that in a moment. But also just thinking right toward that person, not allowing our mind to go into improper places, the way that we view people or the grudges that we hold, things like that. And so in that chapter in Leviticus, it talks about, leaving something for people who are in poverty, not deceiving people, not oppressing people, even if they're that unpleasant neighbor, not holding on to money that person deserves, not putting something to trip up that neighbor in that neighbor's way, not showing partiality, which is what Jesus talked about a few weeks ago and John alluded to. And that's especially hard when politics come into the picture, which is what happened in Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees and the Herodians a couple of weeks ago in our discussion. Then these practical things like Lena talked about, we're providing oil, and bandages or whatever the needs are, but a lot of different ways to love our neighbor. And as we love them, it really requires us to elevate everybody. I think Stephen mentioned everybody, right? We're trying to elevate everybody because, as John mentioned, they're image bearers of God. So it's looking beyond the labels and seeing people as this human is another image bearer of God. And that's why I'm going to honor them and why I'm going to love them. And people define people by labels all the time, and we do too. But it's seeing beyond our human labels and seeing people as God sees them, which requires change my heart, oh God, change my vision too, and seeing people as this person is made in God's image, made to be an image bearer of God. So I need to elevate them, sometimes even above myself. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Jesus died for very ungrateful people in the world. So sometimes even lifting them up above ourselves. And as Jesus finishes off the statement, he says, love your neighbor, but then he says, as yourself. And as John mentioned, do we love ourselves? That's one question to consider. And sometimes the fact that we maybe loathe ourselves for different reasons affects our ability to love other people. It's hard to get past that. And so do I love myself? Here's what John said earlier. If I'm tasked with looking at others as image bearers, I must understand myself as one too. To love others, I must love myself. And to love God leads me to love myself too, not in human terms of value or memory or reputation, but as one that is a facet that reflects the light of God. So we have to love ourselves. And then also to love our neighbor as ourselves. I think it goes one step beyond the golden rule, because the golden rule says treat other people the way that you want to be treated. But my wife, Christine, and I, we've had lots of long conversations about this where I cause problems because I love her the way that I want to be loved. And that works out super well. Because the things that I enjoy and the ways that I want to be treated and my priorities are oftentimes not what my wife's are. She's a very words of affirmation oriented person, and I'm very good at doing things for people and not ever telling people how I appreciate them or what I think about them. And so I get reminded all the time, if you want to love me well, you have to love me the way that I want to be loved. And so I think as we're loving people as ourselves, we love ourselves the ways that we want to be loved, right? Because we know that. When we love other people, we have to think about how they want to be loved also. And again, my wife is another one of my pastors in that sense, because she shepherds me along and shows me areas that I still have to grow in all the time. And so loving my neighbor requires me to ask and observe how someone else wants to be loved, not just how I would want to be loved. And even someone else that I may not agree with, or somebody who's even hateful toward me, how do they want to be loved? And oftentimes, I want to love myself pretty extravagantly. I don't have the means and resources to do that all the time. But if you had me write out a list of ways I want to love myself, like if I had no restrictions or no lack of resources, I'd be pretty good at loving myself. Like I'd have an awesome story to tell about how I love myself. But would I do that for somebody else, especially someone else who's challenging for me to love, just because they're an image bearer of God? There's so much to consider. And there's a lot of self-evaluation, I feel like, as a result of what Jesus says. So it's a pretty brilliant answer, but it's a pretty convicting answer as well. And so hopefully the best thing we can take away today is just the prayer, God, help me to see myself from your perspective and help me to see people from your perspective as image bearers of you, and help me to treat them in ways that you would truly treat them. And I think if we ever grasp even a taste of that as a church community or as followers of Jesus, even from other places, that alone will draw people to Jesus. You just don't see that happen in our world today. And I think people underestimate the power of loving people all the time. And that's one of the most powerful witnesses. Jesus tells his disciples that. Like, people will know that you're my followers if you love each other, if you love your neighbor. What a powerful witness. What a difficult thing to actually do. But hopefully these conversations, give us some ways to go from here.